I'm Kelsey. I have my booktube hat, and I am here today to film my reading wrap-up video for the month of January. I read a total of 5 books in January, or rather I completed 5 books in January. And I have 4 of them here, and one of them was a library book, which I have already returned because there were holds on it. The first book I read in this new year was Rules of Civility by Amor Towles, whose name I hope I am pronouncing correctly. This was a book that I picked up several years ago because I saw a free copy of it sitting on a free book cart in my college library, and so I grabbed it, and it's taken me years to get around to reading it because it just hasn't been a high priority, but now I've read it and I'm glad that I have. This is a historical fiction novel set in the 1930s in New York. The protagonist is a young woman named Katie Content. This is framed by an introduction where several decades later in the 60s, Katie and her husband are at an art exhibition and they see a photo of a man that she used to know named Tinker Gray, and so she begins to reflect on the year 1938 that she knew Tinker and all of the things that happened in her life during that year, which were pretty major. So this has a sort of nostalgic looking back at this particular era feel to it. The prose, I think, was the best part of this book for me. I feel like almost every page there was something that I would say, oh, that would be like quotable on something about literature or New York or the 1930s or life. I feel like this is the sort of writing where you go through it and just enjoy the little snippets of witty, smart prose. It also has a lot of literature references, so for book people who like books, the literature references are enjoyable. The title of this book actually comes from a document by George Washington called The Young George Washington's Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. And that entire document is provided in an appendix at the end of the book. I actually read this thing in college for one of my college courses, and I found it incredibly amusing from a modern perspective, and I didn't realize when I started this book that that's what this was named after, so that was a pleasant discovery for me. I am going to see if I can find a good link to somewhere where you can read that online, George Washington's Rules of Civility, because they are pretty amusing. So I'm going to link that down below because I'm sure there's somewhere I can find that on the internet for you. But this book ended up being thematically appropriate as a New Year's read, even though I did not plan it at all, because it goes from, it starts on a New Year's and then goes through the entire calendar year, and it's divided by seasons. And it starts with some New Year's resolutions, and we see how these characters' lives change over the course of an eventful year. And I will be honest, it is not all great things that happen to these characters over the course of that year. But if I were to get a New Year's message from this book, I would say it would be that Katie is a character who takes, over the course of 1938, a lot of bold risks, personally and professionally, and it ends up taking her really, really far in life and society and in her career. So I guess if I were to extract a New Year's message from this book, it would be, don't be afraid to take more risks, they might pay off. If I had one problem with this book, it would probably be that the ending I felt really didn't pack much of a punch at all. It just sort of wrapped up how it had to wrap up, given that it was an extended flashback, essentially, and then it was over and it was done. And so it didn't really stick with me the way I would hope that a book would. So I gave this 4 stars when I finished reading it because of how much I sort of savored and enjoyed each little bit of it. But a couple days went by and I realized that it wasn't sort of sticking with me much. So I considered downgrading my rating to 3 stars at that point, but I was feeling generous, so I left it. 4 stars. The next book I read was a reread of The Hero and the Crown by McKinley. This is the prequel to The Blue Sword. I read both of these in high school. For some reason I only had The Hero and the Crown, so I started reading this one first, even though when I first read them, I read them in publication order, which is The Blue Sword first. So I will, in the next few months, be reading The Blue Sword as well, and then I'll probably want to do a more in-depth review video of the 2 books as a unit. But basically this book follows Erin, who is a princess, but that's not the term in this book. The term in this book is First Soul, but basically she's a princess of Damar. And in The Blue Sword, Erin is an absolute legendary hero. And so this is the book that goes back in time and tells her story. These books are from the 80s, and I have to say, this old cover art, that has got to be like the ugliest dragon I have ever seen on the cover of a book. But that's okay. I feel like this book sort of had 2 separate halves that were kind of trying to be 2 different sorts of fantasy novel. I felt like the first half was, you know, a princesses can slay dragons 2 coming-of-age adventure fantasy, but was told largely in flashbacks, but in terms of style was pretty straightforward. And then about halfway through, it gets a little more stylistically weird and out there and what is going on. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think that's something that makes this maybe less a pure children's book. I can sort of see in the way McKinley is handling the stranger magical elements how she'll develop that style in later books like Deerskin or Rose Daughter or Spindle's End, and I kind of think she does it better in those and has more of a point to it, but I enjoyed seeing it in this nevertheless because she's one of my favorite authors and I just love her writing. I found the ending to be sort of emotionally ambiguous, which also to me felt like a very McKinley thing to do. I remember not liking that so much when I read this in high school, but I appreciated it more now. I will say though, reading this, I was wishing I remembered The Blue Sword better than I did, because I think a lot of this is sort of playing into how you feel about Erin from what you hear about her in The Blue Sword, and I don't remember it that well, so I'm wishing I'd kind of gone in publication order for my reread. But we'll see when I read The Blue Sword if I stand by that statement or not. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. McKinley from the 80s, very good. Whoops. The next book I read is the one that came from the library, and that is The Wrath and the Dawn by Renée Adieh. This, as I mentioned in my TBR, is a young adult fantasy retelling of the story of Scheherazade from the 1001 Nights, otherwise known as the Arabian Nights. And this is another one where it's going to be 2 books. The second book in this duology, The Rose and the Dagger, is coming out in May, I think, so a lot of my opinions on The Wrath and the Dawn are going to be a little bit contingent upon what I think is going to happen or how I think the story is going to develop in the second book, so I'll probably also, with this one, do a fuller review video once the second book comes out and I manage to read it. But I came into this book sort of uncertain about what exactly it was on 2 fronts. First of all, I wasn't sure whether it was a book taking place in a fantasy world that resembled the Middle East, or whether it was a historical fantasy actually taking place at a certain point in history. So as I was reading, I recognized that all of the names of countries like Khorasan and Parthia were real. Those are both historical regions in Iran that have a long history that I don't know much about. So I was unable to discern exactly how much of the world building was coming from history and how much was being created by the author. Obviously, it's a fantasy novel. There is magic in this world, so it isn't exactly our world. But if anyone has read this book and knows a little more about the history of the region and was able to identify like what century this is based on, I would love to know. The cultural influence was Persian because we're talking about areas that are in modern day Iran. But that's just something I would like to learn more about the world building in this book, is how much of it is historical and how much of it is fantastical. The second thing I was confused about was how it was going to be a duology, given that as a retelling, it looked like it was basically going to use up the source material in the first book. The story of Scheherazade is the framing device for the Arabian Nights, which I have not read because it is massive and that would be quite an undertaking, and maybe I'll do it someday. I have read Mary Zimmerman's stage adaptation, which is really lovely, but I'm guessing she probably took a lot of liberties with the source material for her own artistic purposes, because I think that's sort of the type of adapter she is. But basically the story about Scheherazade is about a king who marries a new bride every day and then kills her every morning and marries a new one. And Scheherazade comes into this and says, aha, no, I'm gonna win him over. I'm going to tell him stories every night and leave him at a cliffhanger every dawn. And by doing this, she manages to keep his interest in the stories. He wants to know what's next, so he keeps her alive from day to day for 1,001 nights. And by that time, he realizes he loves her and he doesn't want to kill her, and it's happily ever after. So it's a kind of gross story, but it is the stories that Scheherazade tells, that are stories within stories, form the majority of the 1,001 Nights, which is this treasure trove of Middle Eastern folklore. So I was a little confused as to how this was going to be a duology. Was the second book going to be a retelling of something else, or was it going to be like a standalone and a sequel? And I feel like what happened is that The Wrath and the Dawn started with this premise of the Scheherazade story, and then about halfway through it sort of took on a life of its own and like went off with it, running at full speed. And that worked for me because honestly, I don't think the Scheherazade story gives you that much to work with, even though it's theoretically an interesting premise. We are given at the very beginning of the book, so this is not a spoiler at all, an indication that there is something going on with Khalid, the husband, king, murderer figure, that is more than, you know, the pure disgusting misogyny of the original story, that there's some possibly magical reason why he has to kill a wife every morning. So that opens up the possibility for a romance story that a modern reader can get behind. And this is pretty heavy on the young adult steamy romance, but I enjoyed it. This book so far is actually really light on the magic. I feel like it set up a lot of possibilities for what's going on with the magic in this world that are going to be probably explored farther in the second book, so I don't necessarily want to take fault with things not getting explained until I have read the second book. That said, I did feel like the place where it ended was a good ending for this portion of the story. I sometimes feel with young adult series especially that, you know, like, oh, you're gonna make me wait there for the next book. And even though there's a lot of high-stakes stuff going on at the end of this book, I somehow felt like this is a cool place for me to chill and wait a few months for the second book to come out. I feel like a certain story arc has been completed. I thought the writing style was very polished and evocative. And this was a book that was just hard to put down, especially for me, like books that have thematic elements that have to do with being up at night. I have a really hard time putting them down at night, and this was one of them that like kept me up way too late. So I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. I'll definitely be reading the second book when it comes out. I mentioned in a previous video that I give 5-star ratings very rarely and more because I have a passionate whim and I'm just wildly enthusiastic about something for reasons I can't quite explain, and so the next book is one of those. I am wildly passionate about the Lunar Chronicles for reasons I cannot quite explain. So obviously I gave Winter 5 stars because it is the epic and highly anticipated conclusion to the series, and it is everything fans of the series need, I think, in a conclusion. These books are young adult fairy tale retellings set in the future, so it's like sci-fi fairy tale mashup, teenage girls save the world. And Princess Winter, the title character of this book, is the Snow White figure. And I could nitpick about this book to no end because I feel like fans of the series have been waiting for it for so long. I read all 3 books not long after Crest came out, and then I was waiting for this book. So I had plenty of time to reread the first 3 books and then speculate about what I thought was going to happen in this one. So there were things that happened in this that were not what I was expecting. There were things that happened that were what I was expecting. If I were going to nitpick, I would say that I wish that the Snow White story were a little more central to the resolution of the story as a whole. I love Princess Winter. I actually think she's an awesome character, but she wasn't introduced until very late in the series. And also because it took so long for the main action of the series to get from Earth to the moon, I feel like the sort of dystopian Lunar Society was sort of hastily put together. And these are some of the same issues that I've seen other people bring up on BookTube and in reviews. But frankly, I did not care. I love this series, I think in part because I love fairy tale retellings and I like when they're a little different. And I just feel like this is a premise that sort of shouldn't have worked at all. Like, each book is a new fairy tale retelling with a new protagonist, and together they all turn into a young adult, save the world, sci-fi space adventure. And the fact that Marissa Meyer pulls it off with so much humor and warmth, I love that. This series to me sort of evades the young adult pitfall where everything just gets like hormonal and angsty and sort of wallows in it. I feel like this kept the tone fairly light, and I actually really enjoyed that. This series is also completely based in, I feel like, a lot of serendipitous coincidences that make the plot work. But again, I don't care because it's just sort of fun and it's delightful enough that the plot works at all, and the characters are people that I care for, and I'm invested in their happily ever afters. I really am. 5 stars. The last book I'm going to mention here, I'll keep this quick, is Fudoki by Kij Johnson. I have done a full review video on this. I will link it down below. This is a historical fiction novel with a fantasy story within it about an aging princess in the Heian period in Japan who is preparing to die and starts writing a story about a cat on a journey who transforms into a warrior woman named Kij, and it's used to sort of contemplate mortality and the meaning of life in a really graceful way. If that intrigues you, please check out my full review video. What I failed to mention in the review video, I wanted to show you the map that's in this book. I think it's just lovely. This is a map of Japan with a giant cat in the background that shows Kij journey through Japan as it was in this time period. I also was recently talking with a family member about how few really good books there are about cats that aren't like horror. So if you know of any great books about cats, I would love to hear what you think they are, because I am now curious, because I'm racking my brain, like, have I read any other really great books about cats? I gave this 4 stars. Also, of course, if you've read any of the books I talked about in this video, or if you want to read them, or if you have anything to share, suggestions for books I might want to read, let me know in the comments, please. I would love to hear from you. Okay, bye for now.